Welcome to Gemara Academy. In this class, we will learn Tesis Dibra Maschel, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Hocha Beskufas Mavi Askenun. Let's begin by looking at the flowchart of the Gemara so we can see what Tesis is coming to explain. So here in the Gemara we had a question on Achirim who said in the Brisa that Pesach Pasuach Kilafnim. When the door is open, then the doorstep is like the inside. And we asked, how can we say that when the door is open, the doorstep is like the inside, if we know that the doorstep requires a lechi on the outside of it in order to treat it like the inside, in order to treat it like a Rosh Hashanah. So here in the Gemara we gave the first answer from Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, that we're referring over here to the doorstep of a Mavi, and it's a case where there is a beam covering part of the doorstep, and it's on the inner part of the doorstep. So this is the part of the Gemara that Tosfos is coming to talk about and explain, and let's see the general outline of Tosfos. So Rav Yehuda Amar Rav explained that Achirim are referring to the doorstep of a Mavi where half is roofed and half isn't, and it's the inner part that's roofed. So there are three parts to Tosfos. Number one, Tosfos will explain why it has to be a Mavi. Tosfos told us two Tosfos previous that our Gemara originally was referring to the doorstep of a Mavi, which is a dead-end street, the doorstep of a bayis, a house, or the doorstep of a chutzner, a yard, the doorstep of any of these three places. Why over here does the Gemara say that it has to be referring specifically to the doorstep of a Mavi, the dead-end street? Number two, Tosfos will explain why it can only be half-roofed and why it can be on the outside half of the doorstep. Tosfos will also explain why it's a case where the doorstep has a kaira over half of it, only part of it, and number two, it's only the inner part. And the third part of Tosfos is, Tosfos will explain that the kaira may be placed at a different position and it will be the same din. Although we said it's referring to a case where there's a kaira on the inner part of the doorstep, Tosfos will point out that it could have been explained a little differently and it would still be the same thing, just the Gemara didn't explain it that way. So it's really two parts to Tosfos. Number one, Tosfos explains why these are the specifics of the case that it should work. Number one, it has to be the doorstep of a Mavi. Number two, it has to be that only part of it has a kaira over it. And number three, why it's the inner part. And the second part of Tosfos is pointing out that there's another way it could have been explained and it would be the same din. So let's see Tosfos now in the flowchart form. Rav Yehuda Amar Rav said, Achirim are talking about the doorstep of a Mavi, and like we said, half is roofed, half is not roofed, and it's the inner half that's roofed. So Tosfos begins by explaining why it's referring specifically to a Mavi, and it's in a purple arrow pointing upwards, because he's explaining the case of the Gemara. So before we begin, we're just going to point out that the point over here is, we say when the door is open, it's like the inside. When the door is locked, it's like the outside. The reason why when the door is open, it's like the inside, is because then we say, Pi tikra yered v'saisim. The edge of the beam goes down and closes off, and therefore, now the area becomes a Rosh Hashanah. And that will only work when the door is open, and not when the door is locked. And based on that, we'll understand why it's only the doorstep of a Mavi, why it's only half of it has a beam on it and half doesn't, and why it's only the inner half. So let's see it in Tosfos Tais and go through those points. Specifically by the doorstep of a Mavi, when the door is open, it's like the inside, since the kaira is fitting to permit the Mavi. It's only by a Mavi will we say that when the door is open, it now will say Pi tikra yered v'seisim, it goes down and closes off, and it's effective in turning it into a Rosh Hashanah. This will only work by a Mavi, and the reason is because a kaira is used in order to permit carrying in a Mavi. If there's a Mavi where it's not permitted to carry in, by using a kaira, it accomplishes that now the person could carry in the Mavi, and therefore only by a Mavi will it work that by a kaira, by a beam, we'll say Pi tikra yered v'seisim. Now Tosfos is going to address a question on this, so it's going to be in a purple arrow pointing upwards, because he's supporting what he's saying, but he's addressing a question, and he's going to provide an explanation, so the words are in red, and then the answer will be in green. Even though this Mavi doesn't need a kaira, since it has four walls, for the doorway and door are on the fourth side, this Mavi over here doesn't need a kaira, because this Mavi has its natural three walls, like every dead-end street, and on the fourth side there's a tzuras pesach, there's the shape of the door, which qualifies as a wall. So this Mavi does not require a kaira. So why over here do we say that the kaira will say by a Pi tikra yered v'seisim, since a kaira is effective by a Mavi that needs a kaira? Says Tosfos, nevertheless, since it's fitting to permit the Mavi in a case where the Mavi would need it, so therefore it'll work over here as well. And Tosfos says over here, it combines together and it's like it's roofed 4 tefachim. So just to bring out the main part of what he's saying here, and then we'll get to the last few words, which are very important. What Tosfos is saying is that even though this specific case, the Mavi does not require and doesn't need a kaira, because it's already fully closed off on it through other measures, nevertheless, since a kaira is effective by a Mavi, it'll be over here effective as well, in a sense that we're going to say Pi tikra yered v'seisim when the door is open. Now Tosfos concludes and says it combines together and it's like it's roofed 4 tefachim. The Maharsha explains that Tosfos argues with Rashi over here. And Tosfos holds that when the door is open, not just under the beam is it a Rishus HaYachid, but the whole doorstep is a Rishus HaYachid. And this is explained also by various Rishonim, and the Ritva gives an explanation. He says because we view the doorstep as one entity. And that's what we're going to bring up over here in a scroll, that Rashi learns that only under the kair it's like the inside. Tosfos, according to the way the Maharsha learns it, holds that the whole doorstep is like the inside. So here Tosfos just brought out a side point, that a kair works by a mavi, and therefore we'll say by it over here, pi tukar yard v'seisim, even though in this case we do not need the kaira. Still, since in general a kaira works for a mavi, we'll say over here, pi tukar yard v'seisim. Now he contrasts that to a yard and a house. But by the doorstep of a yard and house, since the kaira isn't fitting to permit here, if a yard or a house would require fixing in order to permit carrying in it, for example, if a wall collapsed, one cannot use a kaira to accomplish this. Rather, either a pasim, which is one board that's 4 tefachim wide on one side, or a lechi, which will be 2 narrower boards, one on each side. So since the kaira isn't fitting to permit there, even when the door is open, it's like the outside, since only half is roofed. What Tosfos says is that if there is a beam over a part of the doorstep of the bayis or chatzar, even when the door is open, the doorstep is not going to be like the inside, because we're not going to say pi tikar yard v'seisim, it goes down and closes off. And the reason is because a kaira has no business by a yard and a house. And therefore, we're not going to say it goes down and closes off. It's only if the whole doorstep was roofed, then we would say it goes down and closes off, since it's a full 4 tefachim. But here we're referring to that it's only 1 tefach, the beam. So on its own, it doesn't qualify to close off an entire area that's Rishus HaYachid. It's just 1 tefach. And since it has no business by a yard and a house, therefore we're not going to say it goes down and closes off. And just to point out that in this Tosfos differs from Rashi once again. Rashi says the reason that Rav Yehuda Marav doesn't refer to a bayis and a chatzar is because a bayis typically has a doorstep that's 4 tefachim wide and a roof that's 4 tefachim wide. So it's going to go down and close off. In other words, Rashi is saying that if a bayis would have a beam that's 1 tefach on top of it, we would refer to a bayis. Tosfos disagrees. Tosfos says if the bayis has a beam that's 1 tefach, we will not refer to it because it will not go down and close off, since a beam has no business and no place by a house and a yard. So we just brought that down again in a scroll. Rashi explains that we're not talking about a house because the roof is usually 4 tefachim, but otherwise we would. So that's the first point in Tosfos, bringing out how pi tikar yard v'seisim, that it should go down and close off, will only work by a mavi where a beam belongs, and we could say by it when it's needed pi tikar yard v'seisim. Here we'll also say pi tikar yard v'seisim, but by a house where it never belongs, and we don't say by it goes down and closes off, we won't say it over here either, even when the door is open. Now Tosfos is going to move on to the next point, explaining why it's referring to a case where only part of the doorstep has a beam on it and not the whole doorstep. Tosfos says, and he specifically chose here half roofed, because if it's entirely roofed, even when it's locked, it's like the inside. Like we said, pi tikar yard v'seisim, that's the focus over here. If it's a case where the whole doorstep has a roof, then we'll always say pi tikar yard v'seisim. When the door is open and when the door is locked, we'll always say it goes down and closes off, and the doorstep will always be like the inside. It'll always be a Rishus HaYachid. And the reason is, says Tosfos, for a regular doorstep within the doorway is 4 tefachim wide. A typical doorstep of a mavi is 4 tefachim wide. And therefore, if the whole thing is roofed, that means we have a roof that's 4 tefachim wide, and a roof that's 4 tefachim wide over an area that's 4 tefachim wide will always turn into a Rishus HaYachid, because we say pi tikar yard v'seisim, since we have the parameters of an area that could be a Rishus HaYachid. Now Tosfos supports what he's saying now by addressing a question on what he said, that a typical doorstep is 4 tefachim wide, and that is, even though we established that the doorstep of the Tanakama isn't 4 tefachim wide, the Tanakama referred to a doorstep which is a mokem p'tur, and therefore a person could carry between it and the Rishus HaYachid, and he could carry between it and the Rishus HaRabim. And we explained what's the reason this doorstep is a mokem p'tur. The Gemara said because it's not 4 by 4 tefachim wide. So we see that there's a doorstep that's not 4 tefachim wide. Says Tosfos, that's referring to when it's outside of the doorway. That's not a typical doorstep that's between the doorway. That's a doorstep that's outside of the doorway. But a regular doorstep that's within the doorway is going to be 4 tefachim wide. So that's the second point in Tosfos, explaining why we can't be referring to a case where the entire doorstep has a roof over it, because then we'll always say P Tikra Yard V'Seisim. So it can be a bias and chatzar, because we'll never say P Tikra Yard V'Seisim. It can be entirely roofed, because then we'll always say P Tikra Yard V'Seisim. Now why does it have to be only the inner half, says Tosfos? And specifically when the roof is towards the inside, will it work that when the door is open we say P Tikra Yard V'Seisim, and when the door is locked we do not say P Tikra Yard V'Seisim? But when it's towards the outside, even when it's locked, it's like the inside. Then we'll always say Pitik or Yerd V'Seisim if it's on the outside part of the doorstep. And the reason is, for Rav holds, the outer edge goes down and closes. If it's on the outside part of the doorstep, then the outer part of the beam is going to close down on an area that's 4 tefachim wide, since we said that the doorstep is 4 by 4 tefachim wide. So it'll always go down and close off. We're looking for a case where it goes down and closes off when the door is open, and it does not go down and close off when the door is locked. And that will only work by number 1, a mavei. That'll only work number 2, if half of it is roofed, and number 3, what Tosfos is saying now, is if it's the inner part. But if it's the outer part, it'll always go down and close off. So it comes out, this is the first part of Tosfos that addresses those 3 details when the door is open. So then, since if the mavoi would need a kaira, it would go down and close off. So even though here it does not need a kaira, it still goes down and closes off. But once the door is locked, it will no longer be able to do that, since it's not serving an area directly beneath the beam that's 4 tefachim wide. And now for the last and final point in Tosfos, which is that there's another case that we could have said the teaching of Achiram is referring to, just we didn't. And that is, and he could have spoken about when one tefach is covered and it's in the middle of the doorway. We could have referred to a case where the beam wasn't towards the inside, but rather was in the middle. The point that he's going to bring out in a moment is that it shouldn't be 4 tefachim from the outer edge to the door. As long as between the outer edge of the beam and the door there is less than 4 tefachim, so let's say there's 3 tefachim, it'll be the same thing. When the door is open, so then it goes down and closes off. Since if the mavi needed it, it would go down and close off. Even now when the mavi doesn't need it, it goes down and closes off. And thereby the doorstep becomes a Rishus HaYachid. When the door is locked, since the outer edge only covers 3 tefachim, the point is less than 4, it no longer will turn the area beneath it into a Rishus HaYachid, since it doesn't have 4 by 4 tefachim, which is the requirement for a Rishus HaYachid. Therefore, it won't go down and close off. So we could have referred to, says Tosfos, a case where it was in the middle, so long that there is less than 4 tefachim from the outer edge of the kaira till the door. As long as that's in place, that from the outer edge till the door there's less than 4 tefachim, it'll work that when the door is open, it does go down and close off, and when it's locked, it doesn't go down and close off. So the Gemara could have said that, it just didn't. So to summarize Tosfos basically explains to us that it has to be referring to a mavi specifically, because only then will it work when the door is open, it goes down and closes off. Although this mavi doesn't need it. But since a mavi that would need it, when the door is open, it would go down and close off. Here too, it also goes down and closes off, but only when the door is open, not when it's locked, because it no longer serves the mavi, and it no longer serves an area that's 4 tefachim. Number 2, it'll only work if part of the doorstep is roofed. Since if the whole doorstep is roofed, it always goes down and closes off. Since the doorstep is 4 tefachim, and the roof will also be 4 tefachim, and it'll only work if it's the inner part of the doorstep that's roofed. Since if the outer part is roofed, it'll always go down and close off, because it serves an area that's 4 tefachim, and therefore the doorstep will always be a Rishus HaYachid. And the last and final point in Tosfos is mentioning that there's another case that could have been presented, just the Gemara didn't present it. Just another 2 details over here that came out is, number 1, Tosfos holds that when the beam goes down and closes off, a person may carry on the entire doorstep, since we look at it as one entity, and that's how the Maharsha explains Tosfos, and the Ritva explains a little more the reason for why we would say the whole doorstep becomes a Rishus HaYachid. And number 2, Tosfos disagrees with Rashi, that Tosfos says a beam does not work for a bias and chatzar, whereas it comes out from Rashi, it seems that a beam would work for a bias and chatzar when the door is open. The reason the Gemara did not refer to the bias, Rashi doesn't mention chatzar. The reason why the Gemara doesn't refer to a case of a bias of a house is not because it doesn't work, but rather because typically the roof will be 4 tefachim wide, this is Rashi's understanding, and therefore it'll always go down and close off, and the doorstep will always be a Rishus HaYachid even when the door is locked.